In the early winter of 1875, I was hired by the North Pine Timber Company to join their seasonal operation deep within the northern taiga of Alaska. I was 27 years old, bookish by nature, and had never held an axe in my life. My job was not to fell trees or haul logs, but to maintain order among ledgers and record the day's yield, how many cords of spruce, how many pine trunks trimmed, how much kerosene used per lantern per shift. I was the clerk of the camp, the man behind the ink. My name is Elias Vaughn, and I wrote down everything until writing became too dangerous. There were 121 of us when we crossed the final snow-bridged pass into North Pine Basin. We were a mix of Swedes, Finns, Scotsmen, and a few Americans from the Midwest, men who had worked railways, mines, and lumber yards before this, looking for a winter's pay and the promise of steady work, far from the politics and poverty of their homes. The journey took us 9 days by train and another 6 on foot through ice-locked valleys until the trees seemed to rise up like walls, sealing us into a world made of bark and shadow. The logging site was not a town but a clearing, a frozen scar in the forest surrounded by towering pines. Rows of bunkhouses sat like matchboxes on the white crust of the earth, with smoke rising in threads from blackened stovepipes. There was a cookhouse, a sawmill, a tool shed, and a small telegraph post, which was said to function, though I never once saw it used. And then there was the deep pit near the creek meant for storing ice, they said, though I never saw ice hauled into it, only crates and barrels, often sealed. I know you've heard strange stories about the old frontier, about madness in the cold and things people are said to do when the snow gets too thick and the hunger too loud. But what happened that winter was not a slow descent into madness. It was planned, executed, managed. What happened at North Pine was not a tragedy. It was an operation. Before we go any deeper into this story, I'd like to ask you, where are you listening from? Tell me in the comments. If you find these lost stories from history worth uncovering, subscribe and stay close. What I'm about to share with you was never meant to reach the outside world. Our foreman, Grant Harker, was a man of precise habits and very few words. He was in his mid-50s, gray-haired, and moved with the gait of someone who had never rushed a step in his life. The men respected him, though few liked him. He had been with North Pine for over a decade, overseeing camps in British Columbia and Washington Territory, before being assigned this northern push. He believed in systems, routines, rituals, ledgers. He believed survival wasn't about strength, but about hierarchy and control. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The first few weeks were uneventful. The men worked in pairs or small teams, cutting through massive spruce and pine, stacking timber into sleds for eventual transport. The days were cold but manageable, and there were jokes around the dinner table, stories of home, of girls, of drunken nights in St. Paul. The cook, a gaunt man named Braddock, kept meals simple but hot: beans, salted pork, boiled potatoes. His kitchen was always immaculate, and his knives were always sharp. But there were signs, quiet, easily missed, that not everything was as it seemed. In the first week, a massive white-tailed deer was found hung upside down in a tree at the northern boundary of camp, gutted but uneaten. Some said it was a hunter's prank. Others said it was a warning. Harker had the carcass burned and said nothing more. Then supplies began to thin sooner than expected. Barrels of flour arrived half full. Kerosene disappeared faster than the ledgers could explain. Braddock stopped serving meat by the third week, blaming a delay in delivery from the company depot. I asked to see the supply reports. Harker said they'd been sent, but the telegraph lines were unreliable this far north. I offered to try a manual run of our own. He told me we weren't desperate yet. Still, I kept my books. I noted when the potatoes ran low and when Braddock began serving broth with nothing inside it. I marked how many men began asking for seconds that didn't exist, and how often the cookhouse smelled not of salt and grease, but of something sweet and heavy, something wrong. I remember the first snowfall that never stopped. It came on a Thursday, soft and slow, and by dawn the camp was buried waist deep. The trails we'd come in on vanished. The sled dogs refused to run. We were closed in. And that's when the tone of the place changed. Work continued, but the camaraderie faltered. Men started keeping to themselves. Meals became silent. The firewood pile shrank too fast, and still Harker walked the camp each night, lantern in hand, stopping at each bunk to ask how the men were sleeping. They were sleeping poorly. So was I. And then came the first death. The official report said it was an accident, a falling tree misjudged by the wind. But I was there. I saw how the man's body was moved. I saw the blood in the snow and how Braddock arrived not with a stretcher, but with his apron. That night, stew returned to the table. It was thick and dark and tasted of pepper and iron. Harker gave no speech. Braddock served with a smile, and not a single man asked what animal it had come from. I excused myself early and went to the supply shed. I opened my ledger, flipped to a blank page, and wrote the first entry that I never meant for company eyes. Something has begun. I don't know the shape of it yet, but I feel the edges and they are closing in. The morning after the stew returned, I went to the cookhouse early under the pretense of checking food inventory. Braddock was already there, his sleeves rolled, sharpening his longest blade. He greeted me with his usual brief nod and offered me a tin mug of something steaming. I declined. The air smelled not like breakfast, but of boiled metal and pine tar. I asked him if he'd received a shipment without my knowledge, if perhaps the company had sent fresh meat through some alternate route. He didn't look up from the blade. "You clerks and your ledgers," he said, always worried about the paper, never about the hunger. That day I counted 17 men absent from the mid-morning muster. Harker claimed they'd gone on scouting assignments checking the trail conditions south of the basin, but there had been no orders issued, no gear signed out, and no destination marked on the logboard. When I asked to record their names for tracking purposes, Harker waved me off. "They'll be back," he said. "Don't clutter the books with hypotheticals." I began to worry I was the only one who noticed. In the evenings, I sat alone in the records cabin and began transcribing a second ledger, one meant for no eyes but mine. In it, I recorded everything the company wouldn't want seen: the stew's return to the menu, the shifting behavior of Braddock, the missing men, the altered inventory sheets. Somewhere in me, a sense of duty lingered, though it no longer served the company. It served the truth. It wasn't just numbers that were off. It was the mood. Around the bunkhouses, the men spoke in lower tones. They glanced at each other too long. There was a new edge to their politeness, something performative and cautious, as if every gesture was being weighed. They still swung their axes and felled trees, but the rhythm was different, more brutal, more deliberate, as if the forest itself had become an enemy. The laughter stopped. The songs vanished. No more tales of home, of wives, of children, just the scrape of boots on snow and the clang of metal on bark. One evening, while passing the ice pit behind the cookhouse, I saw Braddock lowering something into the depths. It was wrapped in canvas and bound with cord, but the weight and care with which he handled it chilled me. He worked alone, and when he turned and saw me, he didn't flinch. He smiled calmly, as if we shared a secret. I forced a nod and kept walking. That same week, a new method of food storage was introduced. Braddock began handing out sausages, dark, dense links wrapped in parchment and strung with twine. No explanation, no announcement, just a new offering accepted with silent gratitude by men too tired or too frightened to ask what beast had been killed in a forest long devoid of prey. I tried to track the meat's origin through the remaining crates and barrels, but the ledgers didn't match the contents. Boxes marked dried cod were empty. A barrel of pickled cabbage held nothing but melted ice. My inventory sheet had been altered carefully, cleanly. Someone had gone through my entries and replaced them with false figures. My handwriting, but not my words. On the 7th day after the first snow, A man named Ryland Hayes went missing. He was one of the few who still spoke to me freely. We had once played cards in the break room before things turned silent. That morning, he failed to report to his post. His bunk was empty, his boots gone, and Harker offered no comment. "Some men just leave," he said. "Too much cold makes them run." I knew better. Hayes had just traded me 2 tins of tobacco for spare writing paper the night before. He was planning a letter home. Men who plan letters don't walk into the snow without them. The next meal included sausage again. I stopped eating the meat. I stored the portions in a hidden crate beneath the supply shed, wrapping them in oilcloth and marking each one with the date served. I didn't know what I'd do with them yet, but I knew I'd need them. Proof tally pattern. The next name missing from the roster was Arvdi Kudson, a quiet Swede who shared a bunk with 3 others. They claimed he had gone to chop wood and never returned, but I found the axe he used resting against the sawmill wall still clean and dry. I brought my concerns to Harker again, choosing my words with care. "We've had no outbound supply trains, no inbound messages, and men are disappearing. If there's a plan in place, sir, I need to know it, for the record." He stared at me across his desk for a long while before speaking. "Do you think I'm unaware, Mr. Vaughn?" "No, sir," I said. He nodded slowly. "Then you'll also understand this order depends on confidence. If you begin asking questions too loudly, you'll make other men nervous, and nervous men do foolish things." I left his office with my heart pounding. That night, I dreamed of knives clicking on bones and ropes lowering into black pits. And when I woke, I found a note tucked into my ledger, one I hadn't written. It said only, "Keep quiet, eat well, stay useful." The note I found lodged in my ledger haunted me, not just for what it said, but for what it implied. Someone had accessed my quarters, known which ledger I still used for the company, and had chosen to send a warning rather than a threat. It wasn't meant to terrify, it was meant to instruct, a nudge from inside the system. Stay quiet, eat well, stay useful. It suggested there was a logic behind all of this, a design. The next morning, I rose before the horn and went out to the clearing while the camp still slept. The sky was a soft gray, the snow reflecting a dull light that made the world feel suspended, silent. The trees stood tall, unmoved. From the corner of my eye, I saw Braddock crossing toward the pit behind the cookhouse, his coat drawn tight, dragging a sled behind him. I followed at a distance, but stopped short when I saw Harker step out from behind the tool shed and meet him there. They spoke in low voices, too far to make out the words, but their body language was unmistakable. Not confrontation, coordination. Harker pointed to something in Braddock's ledger, then handed him a folded piece of paper. Braddock nodded once and walked away. I waited until they left and approached the edge of the pit. It was deeper than I remembered. Ice lined the sides, but the bottom was no longer frozen. There were dark stains in the snow near the lip, fresh drag marks. The smell was faint, earthy, sharp-tinged with iron. Later that day, I was summoned to Harker's cabin for a new assignment. He said the company needed detailed tracking of worker productivity, chop counts, hours logged, waste levels. He handed me a list of names. "These men will form the new core teams." He said they'll be given extra rations. In exchange, they'll work longer shifts. You'll monitor the output. I glanced at the list. 12 names. None of them matched the men who had gone missing. What about Hayes Kudson? He didn't look up. Unreliable. Not part of the new structure. I nodded, took the paper, and left. That evening, I lingered near the bunkhouse while the selected men met in the foreman's quarters. I couldn't hear much, but I saw faces. Braddock, of course, Harker, and 3 others. I recognized Stennis, a stoic team lead from the Eastern Quadrant, Corley, the supply monitor who had access to the food crates, and Monroe, the shift supervisor who handled night patrols. The meeting lasted over an hour. When they emerged, their expressions were unreadable. None of them spoke. They walked back to their bunks as if nothing had occurred, but something had shifted. There was a new confidence in their gait, a quiet certainty. The following day, a man named Laurent Jorvik suffered an accident. He was working alone near the creek when a pine trunk suspended on a tilted sled broke loose and crushed his legs. By the time help arrived, he had lost too much blood. Braddock was among the first on scene, not with a stretcher, but again with his apron and a canvas roll of tools. Jorvik was declared dead on sight. His body was not brought to the medical tent. No one questioned it. I went to the supply shed that night and opened my hidden crate. The sausages I'd stored had turned. The cold wasn't enough to preserve them without salt. I threw them into a snowbank behind the shack and stood there watching the fog of my breath fade into the black. When I turned to go back inside, I found a figure waiting in the shadows. Corey. "You shouldn't keep things worn," he said. "Wastes food, raises suspicions." I said nothing. He stepped closer, close enough for me to smell tobacco and grease on his coat. "I've seen your ledgers, the other ones. I'd stop writing in them. Words travel even in silence." I thought about lying, denying, but something in his tone told me he already knew everything he needed to know. Instead, I asked, "What is this, Corley? What are we doing?" He gave a faint smile, almost sympathetic. "We're surviving, that's all." Then he walked off into the dark. After that, I stopped eating anything I hadn't prepared myself. Dry biscuits, black tea, snow melt boiled 3 times. I grew thin. My hands shook in the mornings, but my mind stayed clear, and I kept writing. By the 3rd week, the structure of camp had changed. There were now tiers of men, those who ate from the foreman's stores and those who ate from Braddock's pot. The former grew stronger, the latter weaker. Assignments shifted accordingly, and yet no one complained. No one left. The snow had sealed us in, yes, but so had something else, something deeper. The sense that no one out there was coming, that we were alone, and that silence above all was rewarded. One night, I found a small wooden token tucked under my bunk pillow. Carved into its surface was a symbol, a saw blade wrapped in flame. I didn't know what it meant. Not then, but I would learn. I kept the token. I didn't know what else to do. I turned it in my fingers at night, tracing the saw blade and flame with my thumb, wondering what circle I had been invited into or warned about. I tucked it beneath the floorboard beside my ledger and resolved to speak of it to no one. The next day, the work schedule shifted again. A man named Wexley Coates was pulled from his regular team and assigned to a solo task in the southern tree line, a known danger zone where snowdrifts disguised sudden drop-offs and logs had a habit of shifting even when pegged. Wexley was young, broad-shouldered, quick with a laugh. He was well-liked, and yet no one questioned the reassignment. I did. I approached Monroe, who had been overseeing assignments lately with an efficiency bordering on indifference. I asked him why Wexley was being sent alone without a partner, without a tether line. Monroe shrugged. "He's strong. He can handle it." "Strong men don't work alone in the South Woods," I said. He looked at me, then flat and unreadable. "They do now." Wexley didn't return that evening. A search party was not sent. Braddock, however, seemed particularly busy the next day, rising before dawn and stoking his cook fires with an intensity I hadn't seen before. That night, stew was served again, this time with meat that tasted smoked, seasoned, nearly sweet. The bowls were larger. The men chewed slower. No one spoke. I sat at the edge of the mess hall, sipping broth I hadn't touched, watching as the men cleaned their bowls and licked their spoons. There was a satisfaction on their faces that disturbed me more than the silence. Later, I returned to my bunk and checked the floorboard. The token was gone. The realization that I was being watched didn't surprise me. What chilled me was the implication someone had come into my cabin, found my hiding place, and taken the symbol without disturbing a single paper or page. I wasn't being punished. I was being tested. The following afternoon, I saw something that confirmed what I had only suspected until then. Near the edge of camp, behind the storage shed, I spotted Corley and Monroe speaking in low tones to a third man I didn't recognize. at least not right away. His coat was unfamiliar, his hat pulled low, but when he turned, I saw the eyes. Braddock. They were standing beside what looked like a ledger of mine. I stepped back into the shadows before they saw me, my breath shallow in my throat. I didn't know how they had gotten it. I had kept it locked, hidden away, but there it was, open on a crate, its pages fluttering slightly in the wind. That night, I found a fresh blank ledger on my bunk. No note, no signature, just a message as clear as firelight. Rewrite it. Or else. And yet, the very next day, something unexpected happened. Stinnis, one of the foreman's chosen few, collapsed mid-shift. No injury, no visible wound. He simply fell to his knees beside a felled tree and did not get up. The men nearby froze. No one rushed to help. Harker arrived within minutes, assessed the scene, and gave a quiet order. Braddock and Corley lifted the man between them and carried him toward the cookhouse. I followed at a distance, keeping to the edges through brush and snowdrift. I watched them disappear behind the cookhouse into the ice pit. They didn't come back out. Hours later, the scent of roasted meat drifted across the camp. The workers gathered early that night. Some brought bowls in advance. Some stood outside the cookhouse waiting like they were lining up for tickets to a show. And when the doors opened, they entered without a word. I couldn't go in. Instead, I went to the southern edge of the camp where Wexley Coates had been assigned. I followed the trail markers until they ended abruptly near a ravine. There, half buried in snow, was a leather glove, one finger missing. I remembered Wexley wore gloves with the seams turned out. I picked it up and found blood, dried, blackened, frozen into the fabric. No footprints remained, only drag marks quickly snowed over. I returned to camp under cover of darkness and placed the glove on Harker's porch. No note, no accusation, just a sign that someone still remembered. The next morning, I was reassigned not to paperwork, but to lumber duty. Change of pace, Harker said. See what the real work feels like. He gave me an axe with a chipped head and sent me to the western line. Alone, I chopped for hours, fingers numb, breath sharp in my lungs. I thought about slipping away into the trees, but there was nowhere to go. The snow swallowed direction, the sky was white with no horizon, and I knew they would come after me. Not to bring me back, but to make sure I didn't come back at all. So I chopped, and when dusk fell, I returned to camp alive. That night, no one looked me in the eye. There were 3 main ledgers in camp, one for supply, one for labor, and one for shift assignments. All were kept in a locked chest in the storage cabin, which I still technically had access to despite my reassignment. Late one night, under the pretense of retrieving replacement axe heads, I unlocked the chest and removed the ledgers one by one, lighting a single candle for inspection. The labor book looked normal, rows of names, wages, and tallies of rations distributed. The supply ledger was more complicated. Entire pages had been removed, cleanly cut, not torn. What remained was vague and filled with euphemisms, special provisions, reserve cuts, organic fallback. None of these terms were in any of the official North Pine codes I had been trained to recognize. But it was the shift ledger that held the truth. Tucked inside its back cover was a folded sheet, stained and creased, handwritten in a different style than the rest. It wasn't labeled, it didn't follow the calendar, it was just a list. Names, dates, notes like suitable condition, isolated, minimal disruption. Many of the names had been crossed out. Every crossed out name matched a man who had gone missing. My hands trembled as I reached the bottom of the list. The most recent name, written but not yet crossed out, was Anton Hilke, a quiet man from the Bohemian border, strong, soft-spoken, always among the first to rise. The date beside his name was tomorrow. I stayed up that night considering my options. I could warn him, but doing so would expose myself. Or I could do nothing and preserve the illusion of silence. But the thought of Hilke's boots disappearing from beside his bunk, his name vanishing from the rolls, his flesh boiled into the next batch of stew, I couldn't ignore it. At breakfast, I sat beside him. He greeted me kindly, surprised. We hadn't spoken much before. I asked him how he'd been sleeping. He said the nights were louder now, that he'd been hearing things, soft chopping near the cookhouse when no one was meant to be working. I told him as carefully as I could that his name was on a list, that if he valued his life, he should pretend to injure himself today. Something light, a wrist sprain, anything to keep him off the work schedule. He stared at me for a long time, unmoving. Finally, he said, "You're part of it too, aren't you?" "No," I whispered, "but I'm not allowed to leave." He nodded. That was all. Later that day, word spread through camp that Hilka had fallen from the storage platform and twisted his ankle. The timing was too perfect. I knew someone would suspect. That night, my cabin was searched. I had locked the door, but it didn't matter. When I returned, the blankets were disturbed, the floorboard pried up, the false-bottom tin box left open and empty. My ledger, the hidden one, was gone. There was no note this time, but at dinner my bowl was served last. And when I sat, I noticed every man at the table watching me quietly, casually, just long enough. I didn't eat. Instead, I excused myself and walked toward the edge of camp, pretending to smoke. In my coat, I'd hidden a scrap of the original list, the one with Hilka's name. It was the only proof I had left. I buried it beneath the snow, marked by a notch in a pine root. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I believed someone would return one day, dig it up, and know the truth. Or maybe I was already beginning to believe I wouldn't survive this place. That night, a man named Fisher went missing. He was not on the list I had seen, which meant somewhere there was another list, a newer one. I wasn't the only one keeping records. Fisher's disappearance rattled the camp, but not for the reasons you'd expect. No one searched. No one asked. There was a collective silence around his absence that felt more like ceremony than oversight. It was as if his name had always been temporary, always destined to fade. But what disturbed me most was the lack of ritual. No work reassignment, no redistribution of his tools. His bunk was simply left untouched, the blanket folded, the boots neatly aligned beneath. A placeholder, a warning. The next evening, during a supply check, I was asked to inventory a section of the storage tent I had never entered before. Harker himself escorted me, claiming the lock had jammed and required special access. Inside were crates marked with faint initials and dates, none corresponding to any official shipment manifest I'd ever seen. Among the crates sat a small chest with a red leather cover and iron clasp. Harker opened it without hesitation. Inside was a ledger, bound tightly, thicker than mine, and hand-labeled with an insignia. I recognized the same saw blade and flame from the wooden token. The pages were filled with entries in a tight, clinical script. Each page recorded a name, a date, and then measurements: body weight, muscle density, notes on health, and temperament. Sections were labeled yield potential and preparation notes. Below that came method of processing: boiling, smoking, jerky. At the bottom of each page was a small box: overall quality rating. I felt bile rise in my throat. Harker said nothing. He stood beside me, hands behind his back, watching as I turned each page with growing horror. 53 entries, each carefully cataloged, each ending with a signature I didn't recognize. "In Braddock," I whispered, "this isn't a record. It's a recipe book." "No," Harker replied, his voice even. "It's a survival protocol." I closed the book slowly. "There's another one." I said, "Someone else is keeping track." He didn't deny it. He only said, "Accuracy improves with collaboration." Then he turned and left me in the tent alone. I didn't take the ledger, I didn't dare, but I memorized the final entry. Anton Hilka, January 3rd, withheld due to injury. Reevaluate on recovery. Lower yield expected if atrophy sets in. He was still on the list, still scheduled. I had only bought him time. That night, I found Hilka at the edge of camp, soaking his foot in a tin basin of melted snow. His eyes were hollow. "I saw the fire last night," he said. "Braddock was boiling something again." I hesitated. "It wasn't you." He shook his head. No, but it was someone. I heard a scream before it went quiet. I didn't tell him about the ledger or the rating box or the idea that he had been measured like livestock. Instead, I sat beside him and shared a piece of my last biscuit. "We have to get out," he said. "There's nowhere to go. There's the river, it's frozen. Then we go over it?" I didn't answer. He looked at me, voice low. "You've seen the books, haven't you?" "Yes." "Then you know they'll never stop, not until they've run out of names." And in that moment, I realized he was right. This wasn't a contingency plan. This wasn't desperation. It was a system, a hierarchy built on silence and consumption. And we were still inside it. The plan wasn't complicated. That was its strength. Hilka and I would leave before first light, taking only what we could carry. Flint, a single hatchet, a rope, dried biscuits, and my hidden pages. We'd follow the tree line until we reached the frozen river, then cross over and try to reach the nearest rail spur marked on an old map I'd found buried in the bottom drawer of the storage cabin. It was over 30 miles south. In summer, a 3-day walk. In winter, with snow up to the hip, maybe 6, if we were lucky. We knew we wouldn't be followed immediately. The inner circle relied on fear to keep people still, not fences, not chains. As long as they believed they were being watched, the others would not run. But something happened that we hadn't planned for. The night before we were set to leave, one of them turned up dead. Corey, his body was found in the clearing behind the cookhouse. Face down, arms spread, skull shattered as if by a blunt strike from behind. His boots were missing. His gloves too, and there were no signs of a struggle, no footprints, just the body half buried in fresh snow like someone had meant for him to be found. Braddock identified the corpse. Harker ordered it burned, and no stew was served that evening. The silence that fell over the camp was different from before. This wasn't the hush of guilt or complicity. This was something closer to fear, palpable, sharp-edged. If Corley could be taken, anyone could. I found Hilka behind the bunkhouse, pacing. "They're eating each other now," he said. "The circle is feeding on itself." "No," I said. "Someone else did this." He looked at me. "Someone not in the circle." The next morning, Braddock called off work detail entirely. The men were told to remain in their quarters. Fires were lit early. The smell of boiled cedar filled the camp, masking anything less palatable beneath. I used the time to search Corley's bunk. His mattress had been stripped, the floor swept, but wedged behind a loose board near the corner, I found something that hadn't been taken. A slip of parchment, folded 3 times, ink faded but legible. It was a list, not names this time, words, coded phrases. 5T, high marrow density. 1R, poor yield, recent illness. 3H, best smoked. Frost bruising degrades liver. And then near the bottom, too many watchers. Remove variable. I read it twice before the meaning settled. This wasn't a food ledger. It was research. Corley, or someone, had been refining the process, documenting not just survival strategies, but the biology of consumption. What to take, what to discard, how to optimize. But more chilling than the notes themselves was the last line, scrawled quickly across the margin. Braddock keeps the ratios. Harker keeps the silence. But someone else is choosing. I left the parchment where I found it. That night I couldn't find Hilka. His bunk was empty, his pack missing, his boots gone. No one claimed to have seen him leave. No one had heard a sound. He was just gone. I checked the edge of camp, the river line, even the route where I had buried the scrap of the original list, still undisturbed. But there, wedged into the bark, was a single coin. Wooden, circular, etched with the saw blade and flame. He had taken the plan with him, or someone had taken it from him. Either way, I was alone again. The cookhouse was always locked after dusk, but I'd spent enough nights nearby, watching from the shadows, to know Braddock rarely latched the side window. It faced a thicket of black spruce no one ever entered, too dense to cut, too damp to burn. That night, while the rest of camp drifted through its hushed routines, I slipped out through the back of my cabin, circled wide, and approached the cookhouse from behind. The The snow had softened just enough to swallow my footsteps. I reached the window, eased it open, and crawled inside. The kitchen was colder than I expected. The fire had been banked low. Pans hung in orderly rows, cleavers, bone saws, scrapers, all polished to a dull gleam. The room smelled faintly of cloves, vinegar, and something metallic beneath. At first glance, everything seemed in order. Then I found the drawer. It was set into the bottom of the central butcher's table, flush with the wood. I had never noticed it before. No handle, just a shallow groove. I pried it open carefully, inch by inch. Inside were two objects, a leather-bound book and a stack of index cards tied with twine. The cards came first. Each one was labeled with a number followed by initials and a set of dates. Some included brief notes, early frostbite, discard feet, ideal age range, pre-oaked meat, softens, marrow. I placed them aside and opened the book. It was worse than I imagined. This was no ledger. It was a system. Braddock had created an entire taxonomy, not just of bodies, but of personality types, profiles. He had separated the men into categories based on strength, social bonds, likelihood of being missed, ability to resist, and adaptability. Pages were marked with initials. I recognized F for foreman approved, P for potential, X for excess. Some pages included sketches, muscle diagrams, charts showing yield ratios. Others included behavioral assessments, how each man responded to fear, cold, hunger, and then toward the end was a page I didn't expect to find. Elias V underlined. Beside my name were 3 columns, one labeled observer, one labeled not yet compliant, and the third possible replacement. Replacement for what I didn't yet know. I flipped to the last entries, hoping to find Hilke's name. Instead, I found something worse. A symbol hand-drawn across 2 pages, a ring of figures standing in a circle with one in the center, tied by ropes. Above them was a word I hadn't seen before, not in English nor German, nor any script I recognized. A constructed term, invented. Beside the drawing was a date, January 10th, 4 days away, and a single note, the first real test. I froze books still in my hands. Then I heard the sound, not a door, not footsteps, but breathing, slow, ragged, coming from beneath the floor. I crouched, stepped lightly toward the rear pantry, and opened the trapdoor I had always assumed led to a root cellar. The smell hit me first, mold, damp canvas, and something sour. I climbed down. The space was low-ceiling and lit only by a single oil lamp hanging from a hook. Crates lined the walls. Most were sealed, but one was open. Inside, beneath a thin wool blanket, was Hilke, alive, barely. His skin was pale, lips cracked. His arms were tied at the wrists, but his eyes opened when he saw me. He tried to speak. Nothing came. I pulled the cloth away thinner, much thinner. I reached for my knife to cut the ropes, but a sound above stopped me cold. The cookhouse door had opened. Boots, 2 sets. Braddock's voice, calm, deliberate. "He's not ready yet," he said. Let him stew a bit longer. The trapdoor closed with a soft thud above my head. Darkness settled, and I realized I hadn't saved Hilke. I joined him. The trapdoor sealed above us with a sound soft enough to seem merciful. But in that moment, it was a death nail. Hilke's eyes widened as the light vanished, and I could feel his breath go shallow. The silence in that cellar was like a second weight weighing heavier than the ropes that bound him, heavier than the cold. I worked quickly, cutting through the bindings with my knife, whispering what little reassurance I could offer. He didn't speak, but he nodded, his movements slow, as if every gesture cost him more than he could afford. The crate we'd been stored in had no lid anymore. Perhaps they hadn't needed it. Perhaps they thought no one would come back down. I found a box of root vegetables, half frozen, stashed behind a crate marked dry beans. I fed Hilke slices of turnip, rubbing snow on his lips to rehydrate him. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. The oil lamp above us flickered and finally died, leaving us in full black. But darkness has one gift. It makes sound louder. That was how I heard it. The click of a latch, a mistake. Braddock, in his obsession with order, had forgotten one thing. His apron hung by the stairs held the key ring. When I'd come down, I'd brushed it by accident. I retraced my steps and found it still there, hanging like a promise. 6 keys. 1 for the root cellar, 1 for the storage tent. 1 I recognized as the gate to the northern sled yard. The rest I did not know. I climbed the stairs as quietly as I could and pushed on the trapdoor. It was heavy but not locked, only latched. Braddock must have assumed we were too weak or too frightened to try. He was wrong. I slipped through first, then helped Hilka climb after me. His legs were trembling. I threw his arm over my shoulder and we staggered toward the back pantry. From there, a narrow door led into the adjoining storeroom, a place I had never been allowed. We stepped inside and closed the door behind us. What we found wasn't storage. It was preservation. Shelves lined the walls, not with food, but with clothing. Dozens of shirts, coats, gloves, boots, some stained, some cleaned and folded. Each item was tagged with a small strip of parchment, dates, initials, height, weight. These were the remnants of the missing. Fisher, Knutson, Wexley, Coates. Even Corley's boots were there. And then stacked neatly in the corner were the ledgers. Not Braddock's, not mine, new ones. I opened the top book. The first page bore a single title, Selection Sequence. January 10th. A list of names followed, not just one. Not just Hilka. Not just me. There were 13. Each name followed by a category. Final portion, smoking candidate, reserved for demonstration. Demonstration. Hilka whispered the word before I could. We flipped through the pages. Each name had a profile, notes on condition, how they might respond to confinement, likelihood of resistance. We were not the only ones meant for the pit. This wasn't survival. It was spectacle, a message perhaps, a consolidation of power or something worse. The camp wasn't merely feeding on its weakest anymore. It was showcasing control, choosing people not for weakness, but for visibility. Hilka grabbed my sleeve. "We have to burn it," he said. "All of it." But I shook my head. Not yet. I flipped to the last page. There, written in a hurried hand, was a final note. Those who know must be erased before the 10th. Vaughn is watching. Hilka is unstable. Elias must be processed early if interference continues. Processed. I stared at the word until it blurred. We were already past the threshold of secrecy. We were now a liability to their order, and there would be no more warnings, no more notes. I stuffed the ledger into my coat. Hila took the key ring. We slipped through the side door into the snow, our footsteps muffled by the rising wind. We didn't run. Not yet. We had one thing left to do before escape. The wind that night carried no scent of smoke, no sign of cooking. The camp was quiet in a way that suggested absence rather than rest. The snow had softened the edges of every path, every building, every footprint, until the whole clearing felt like a blank page someone had half written, then abandoned. Hila and I moved under the cover of darkness, ducking between bunk houses and storage sheds, following the narrow alleyways that formed between structures. The foreman's cabin sat at the far end of the camp, raised slightly above the others, its front porch built from heavier timber, its windows always curtained. We reached it without incident. The lock yielded to Braddock's keys. Inside it smelled like cedar oil and dust. A desk stood in the center, clean and orderly, papers stacked, ink pot capped. Beside the desk was a cabinet with several drawers. We moved quickly, silently. The first drawer held work schedules, the second supply invoices, most of them forged or altered. But the third drawer, lower, deeper, held something else. Telegraph slips, handwritten, stamped, dated, never sent. I scanned the first one, dated over 5 weeks earlier. Request immediate resupply. Conditions deteriorating, 5 men lost, camp morale declining. Another, injuries mounting, game scarce, consider emergency recall. And then one dated a few days before the first man went missing. Supply train not expected before February. Advise preparation for extended isolation. Consider reduction measures. The last one was dated only a week ago, all stable. Output consistent, no intervention required. It was signed not by Harker, but by someone from company headquarters, a name I didn't recognize. Gila held up another paper, thinner, yellowed, transmission to be delayed, direct orders from central office, observation ongoing. He looked at me. They knew, he whispered. I nodded. They still know. It wasn't just a failure of communication. It was a deliberate withholding. We'd been kept here, watched, studied. The deaths weren't just ignored. They were useful, measured, expected. We opened the cabinet's lower drawer and found a wooden box. Inside, more ledgers, but older, labeled not by year, but by phase. Phase 1, initial yield estimates. Phase 2, integration protocols. Phase 3, ration efficiency trials. Each included charts, line graphs, detailed breakdowns of how long a population could sustain itself without external food sources depending on the availability of internal biomass. It didn't use the word cannibalism once, but it didn't need to. I looked at Hilla. This isn't about survival anymore, I said. No, he said, it's about proof. We took the most damning documents and stuffed them into our coats. I wrapped the oldest ledger in a strip of cloth, tied it tight. We had what we needed. Then from outside, we heard it. A bell. Once, then twice. The camp bell was mounted at the center of the clearing just above the water pump. It was only ever rung during work assignments or when someone went missing, but it was well past midnight. Gila looked out through the curtain. His face went pale. They're all outside, he whispered. We stepped out onto the porch, keeping to the shadows. He was right. The entire camp, dozens of men, stood in silence, encircling the bell post. No one spoke. No one looked at each other. The air was still. Then Harker stepped into the ring. He didn't speak, not yet. He raised a piece of paper and held it aloft. From this distance, I couldn't read the words, but I recognized the shape. It was the ledger from Braddock's drawer, the one with the selection list. He turned slowly in a circle, showing it to everyone. Then he looked toward the cookhouse and pointed, and the crowd began to move, not toward us, but toward the pit. The figures moved in near silence, boots crunching faintly against the crust of snow, breaths curling like smoke around bowed heads. No voices, no lanterns, only the occasional glint of steel under the moonlight. Axe heads, belt buckles, the metal edge of Braddock's cleaver swinging at his side like a pendulum. Hilka and I trailed them at a distance, moving between trees just beyond the outer bunkhouses. We stayed low. We didn't speak, but with every step closer to the pit, my chest felt heavier, as if the cold itself had thickened. When we reached the edge of the clearing, we crouched behind a stack of firewood and watched. The crowd had formed a circle around the pit, just as depicted in the drawing I'd seen in Braddock's book. 13 bodies forming the ring, one in the center. But there was no one in the center now, just Braddock. He stood with his arms behind his back, the ledger tucked beneath one elbow. Harker stood opposite him, arms crossed, flanked by Monroe and Stennis. Braddock opened the book and cleared his throat. "A change has been made," he said. The men did not react. He flipped to a page near the middle and read a name aloud. It wasn't mine. It wasn't Hilka's. It was someone we hadn't expected. Stennis. I turned to Hilka, his brow furrowed. Stennis took a single step forward, his mouth a tight line, hands clenched. Then he stopped. "This wasn't the arrangement," he said. Braddock's face remained blank. "You've become inconsistent. I built this circle." Braddock's voice was even. "And now you break it." Monroe shifted to the side as if preparing to intercept, but it never came to that. From the edge of the crowd, 3 men approached, faces I recognized only distantly. Not inner circle, not favorites. Workers, ordinary. They flanked Stennis. One raised a length of rope, the other held a meat hook. Stennis turned to Harker, betrayed. But Harker simply said, "This is for efficiency." The crowd closed in. What followed was not ritual. It was not even execution. It was practice. Clean, mechanical. When the body was lowered into the pit, no one wept, no one flinched. Then Braddock returned to the book and read the next name. "This one, Elias Vaughn." I froze. No one moved. Braddock looked up. "Absent," he said. "Mark for retrieval." Then he read a second name. "Hilka, absent." He repeated, "Mark for retrieval." Harker took a step forward. Adjust the sequence. Elevate substitutes. Braddock nodded and scribbled something in the margins. Then he said a third name, Monroe. This time the crowd stirred. Even Hilka inhaled sharply beside me. Monroe blinked. What is this? You've stopped reporting intake, Braddock said. 3 meals unaccounted for. 2 missing portions last week. You've broken protocol. Monroe stepped back, hand instinctively going to the hatchet on his belt. But Harker didn't stop it. He turned his back, and that was the signal. They took Monroe the same way. Gila whispered, "It's coming apart." "No," I said. "Someone's changing the rules." We backed away slowly out of the tree line as the crowd dispersed. There was no announcement, no conclusion, just the soft sounds of shovels against frozen dirt and Braddock's steady voice taking roll again. It wasn't about morality, it was about control. But now even control was uncertain because if the names could change, then so could the outcome. We didn't sleep. We barely paused long enough to breathe. Before the sun broke across the ridgelines, Gila and I packed the pages we had stolen, Braddock's ledger, the copied telegraph slips, the adjusted list, and moved east toward the frozen river. The snow was deeper than it had been in weeks, and our progress slowed with every mile. By noon, we reached a ridge overlooking the basin, and there below was the river, white, vast, winding like a scar through the forest. We could see the far tree line on the opposite side, untouched. Gila dropped to his knees beside a snowbound boulder and whispered, "We make it across. We live." But something in me hesitated. It was too quiet. No one had followed us. No horns, no alarms, just absence. We moved down the slope in silence, reached the riverbank, and stepped onto the ice. It held solid, cracked in places, but steady beneath our boots, a quarter mile, maybe less, to the other side. And then we heard the voice. It came from the woods behind us. "You're leaving without saying goodbye." We turned. At first I didn't recognize him. Wrapped in furs, face pale from cold, hair matted with snow, but unmistakable. Stennis. He was supposed to be dead. Gila staggered back a step. "You went into the pit." "I did," Stennis said, "and I came out." I couldn't speak. I could only stare at the man who 3 nights ago had been judged, bound, and buried. He stepped forward, dragging something behind him, a sled covered by canvas. "You're not the first to try the river," he said, "but you might be the first to succeed. I'm offering you that chance." Gila raised his voice. "Why would you help us?" "Because it's time someone got out," Stennis said, "but not with everything." He reached into the sled and pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth, tossed it at our feet. Braddock's ledger, the real one. "Leave it," he said. "Leave the names, the ratings, the order." Gila shook his head. "That book proves everything. That book is still feeding the system." Stennis looked at him calmly. "You carry it out, they'll bury it, discredit it, you'll disappear." I looked at the bundle. The pages felt warm from where they'd been pressed against the sled. Inside were records of more than 60 men, calculations, notes on flavor. "But if we don't bring it," I started. "You bring yourselves," he said. "Your words, your memory. That's the only part they can't rewrite." I didn't trust him, but I also didn't have time to question his motives. Gila looked at me. "What if it's a trap?" I looked back at the river. "What if it's not?" Stennis stepped closer. "Leave it here. Walk away. Don't look back." Gila bent down, fingers trembling, and picked up the oilcloth. Then he placed it back on the sled. Stennis smiled faintly. "Good choice." As we turned to go, he added, "And if you do make it out, never speak my name." We crossed the river just as the wind picked up, wiping our tracks behind us. No one followed. But I knew something had followed us anyway. We reached the outpost 2 days later. It sat low in the valley, slumped against the hill like a collapsed lung, half buried in snow, its roof sagging, its chimney split. A signpost leaned crooked at the entrance, faded letters still visible beneath a sheet of frost. Pine Station 4C. Established 1872. There were no signs of life. No smoke, no footprints. only silence and the sound of the wind combing through the pines above. Inside, the station was skeletal, rusted equipment, broken crates, a desk missing its drawers. On one wall, beneath layers of old notices and crumbling paper, was something unexpected, a hand-painted board nailed into the logs. It held 12 names. Each name matched a logging camp. Some I'd heard before, others I hadn't. Next to each name was a small symbol. Most had been crossed out. Only 2 were still untouched. North Pine and another, Stonehook. I stepped closer. Beside the names, carved directly into the wood, was a strange symbol, a circle with 3 vertical bars inside it. I'd seen it once before on the final page of Braddock's ledger, the one marked the first real test. Hila touched the wood. It wasn't just us. No, I said. We were a trial, one of many. On the far side of the room, a rusted metal box hung open on the wall. Inside was a broken telegraph receiver. Wires frayed. No power. I tapped the key. Dead. Hilka sat down, exhausted. Even if we make it to the next town, who will believe us? I sat beside him. They won't, not unless we show them something real. But we left the book. Maybe that was the only way we got this far. Outside, the wind rose again. The trees groaned. We spent the night in silence, huddled beneath torn blankets, listening for sounds we couldn't name. And in the early morning light, I returned to the wall with the names and made my own mark. Under North Pine, I carved a cross. Under Stonehook, I carved a question mark. We set off again at dawn. But now, we weren't just escaping, we were hunting what came next. We reached the mountain road just before midday. It cut a crooked line through the pass, half buried beneath old snow and recent avalanches. But it was still a road, still man-made, still leading somewhere. Hilka had grown quieter. He no longer asked how far, no longer checked the map. He simply walked, one step after the next, as if forward motion itself was survival. Then we saw them. 2 men standing by a mule-drawn sled at the bend in the trail. They weren't from North Pine. That much was clear. Their coats were dark blue, not the brown canvas issued to us. Their boots were polished. They wore gloves and both carried sidearms, holstered but visible. I slowed. Hila did too. One of them raised a hand. "You from the basin?" he called. We didn't answer. He took a few steps forward. "North Pine, right?" Still, we said nothing. The other man pulled something from the sled, a folded sheet of paper, thick and official. He unrolled it and held it up. From where we stood, I couldn't read it, but I didn't need to. I recognized the layout, a clearance manifest, a tool of cleanup. The first man spoke again. "You're not listed." "That's a problem." I took one step forward. "Who sent you?" He smiled faintly. "Same people who sent you." "No one sent us," Hilka said. "Exactly." The man folded the paper and tucked it into his coat. "Company wants the record clean. That means no stories, no letters, no variables." He looked at me. "Your name's Elias, isn't it?" Hilka reached for the hatchet on his belt. I raised a hand, stopping him. "You're not going to shoot us," I said. "Why not?" "Because if you were meant to kill us, you'd have done it before we saw your faces." He didn't reply. I stepped closer. "You're here to offer us something," I said. "Or test us, or both." The second man reached into his pack and pulled out a sealed envelope. No markings, just weight and seal. He handed it to me. "Walk to the station in White Cross," he said. "Hand that to the foreman there. He'll give you new papers, new names, new work." Hilka narrowed his eyes. "And if we don't? Then you'll be listed as presumed frozen, and someone will write a very moving paragraph about how brave you were." I opened the envelope. Inside were 2 slips of identification, pre-filled, and a small black token. "A saw blade and flame, same as before. We already escaped once," I said. The man nodded. "And you can again if you stop asking why." They left us standing there. When they turned the sled down the trail and disappeared into the trees, I looked at Hilka. He looked at the token. "We can disappear," he said. "Yes," I said. But then this never happened, and we both knew we weren't done. The town of White Cross was smaller than we imagined, no more than a collection of wood-framed buildings huddled against the base of the ridge. The snow had thinned by the time we arrived, but the cold still clung to everything, including us. We looked like survivors, hollowed faces, torn coats. Hilka limped. My right hand had gone stiff from frost. No one asked us questions when we walked into the general store. No one asked who we were. Perhaps out here, most men were running from something. We rented a room above the post office using what little cash I had stashed in my boot, half-frozen bills, damp and curled. That night, we sat across from each other in silence. The envelope with new names remained sealed between us. What if they're watching? Hilka asked. They are, I said. Then why are we still alive? I didn't answer. Instead, I reached into my pack and pulled out the thin black notebook I had carried from North Pine. Not the company ledger, not Bradex, mine. And I began to write, not numbers, not names, memory. I wrote it all. Every pit, every list, every absence, every lie. I wrote until my fingers bled through cracked skin. When I finished, I tore the pages loose, bundled them in cloth, and placed them in a dry tin box meant for tobacco. Then I walked to the edge of town, where a single telegraph pole stood crooked at the end of the road. I climbed the embankment, buried the box beneath a tree marked with a single nail, and walked back to town without looking behind me. We took the train south the next morning. We boarded under new names. We sat beside people who would never know who we had been or what we had survived. We didn't speak. We watched the forest pass by, miles and miles of pine, silent, endless, and we lived. Years later, in 1911, a federal investigator looking into financial misconduct at Union Rail Holdings came across a set of sealed records marked Timber Noncompliance Phase 3. Inside was a single file labeled North Pine Basin 1875. But what disturbed the investigator more was not the file itself, but what accompanied it. A weathered tin box. Inside, dozens of pages, handwritten, signed EV. None of the company officials could explain where it had come from. The file was sealed again. The investigation was closed. But a copy of those pages, one copy, was leaked to a local reporter in Anchorage. He never published them, but he kept them. And when he died, his daughter passed them to a regional historian named Margaret Albright. Her essay, Camp 17 and the Math of Flesh, was published in a small academic journal in 1958. Few read it, fewer believed it, but a copy still exists in a library archive filed under Disputed Frontiers. Internal Migration, 1870s. It contains a quote I recognize because I wrote it. If survival means silence, then let me speak. Let me scream. And now you've heard it,